Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to update the firmware on a GreaseWeazle with the gWeasleGUI. So first we're going to go get the firmware. We're going to go to github.com. There we go. We're going to Kier's GreaseWeazle host tools. Okay, there we are. We're at the host tools. Now we see the link here to the firmware repository. So we're going to go ahead and click that. The firmware is what we flash update the GreaseWeazle when the firmware needs updating. So the current release of the firmware is 1.4, and if you already have 1.4, you don't need to do this, but if you would like, for some unknown reason, to flash to an older version, you could, that's still an option, an unrecommended option, but and if you have 1.4, if you had 1.3, you could update to 1.4. If you had 1.4 and the latest one is 1.5, then you could come here and get it. And then, so the download's going to be inside these assets. If it's closed, just open it, and it's going to be in a zip file. So, which is a zip compressed package. So we're going to go ahead and download that. And there we are. We have the firmware. So we're just going to extract all. All right. So we've extracted it into our downloads folder. So now we're going to go ahead and open the GUI, the gWeasleGUI, and over here we see our devices. I currently have 4 GreaseWeazle devices connected, because that is what the Win UAE supports for drives. So that prevents me from needing to do disk swapping. So it looks like COM12 is already at 1.4. So let's check COM9. Yeah, COM9 is at 1.3. So we're going to go ahead and update the GreaseWeazle at COM9. So easily, if you need to change drives, you just change the port here and reload the tools. Right now, we have info selected. That's just for information on the drive. This is like our action in the gWeasleGUI. So it's like our command. So we're going to go ahead and select in here. There are a number of options. We can select read, write, convert, but we're going to select update. Update is the option we're going to use to update the firmware. So we can go into the parameters, and there's not a lot of parameters on update. We can also look at the host tools help to see all the available parameters. If we click the action help button, we will see all the parameters in the GreaseWeazle host tools. Here is file. So the file is going to be the file we're going to update, which is the update file. Tag, that could be used for the GitHub release tag, which I showed you there on the releases Current release has a release tag of v1.4. But we won't be using that, and that is not available in the GUI. So that would you'd have to use additional arguments to use that tag. Device tag is the COM serial port, and that can be specified over here. COM9, it's already specified, so we don't need to worry about it. Force. So this would be used if we wanted to force the update to an older firmware. So we could use the force, like use the force loop, but that would be only if we needed to go to an older version. Like we have 1.3, so if we wanted to go back to 1.2 for some unknown reason, we could use the force tag, and then it would allow us to do so. The bootloader is not implemented in the GUI, and it does not apply to version 5 GreaseWeazle boards. So if you wanted to use that, you'd have to put it in the additional arguments with the dash. You would do dash bootloader. Okay, so now we have here, it's pretty much the only option in the GUI is the force, and then of course the device, which is always in the GUI. So since we're selecting a file that exists on our hard drive, the only button available is going to be existing. That means the file exists on our hard drive. And so new file would be if the file does not yet exist. So we're going to go ahead and select our file, and normally we'd have to go select the file, but it already knows. So we would typically go to downloads and then select our firmware and then go into the firmware and then find it. And the only file type this dialog will accept is the firmware update file. So we just go ahead and click it and click open. And now it is shown here. We can see the file it's going to be updated. And these double arrows, that means it is going to be pushed to the GreaseWeazle board. If the arrows were pointing to the right, that would mean it's going to retrieve data from the drive, the GreaseWeazle drive. But since we are going to push the firmware to the GreaseWeazle, the arrows are pointing to the left. So we're going to go ahead and execute this, and we're going to report the elapsed time of how long it took to execute this command. We're going to execute it and see how that goes. It took 2.38 seconds, and command is complete. And updating the main firmware to version 1.4 has been done. So we're going to go ahead and look at our device, and it still says firmware 1.3, so let's go ahead and reload. Up, and there it is, 1.4, firmware 1.4. So we have successfully updated the firmware on our GreaseWeazle v4. And that's how we do it with the gWeasleGUI.